Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to tackle the rear rim. So first things first, control click on the canvas to mask the tire. Next, from the gear of the gizmo, select the cylinder 3D. We're going to need to set the H divides to 60. Now let's rotate it 90 degrees on the y-axis and scale it up to meet the interior of the tire, and then split unmasked points. Then we can turn off dynamic and scale it in the z-axis. Snap it to the side view and pick inset for the polygon action from the Z-modeler brush, along with flat island for the target and standard for the modifier. Delete that middle edge loop and select QMesh polygroup island from the Z-modeler brush. Alt tag those two polys to QMesh them back, then delete the bottom island. Next, let's choose Insert Multiple Edge Loops from the Z-modeler, and then add in 4 edge loops. Activate Symmetry on the X-axis and select Slide Edge Loop Complete. We're going to add 2 more edge loops in the middle and slide them together. Add 1 edge loop toward the outside and press Group by Normals. Let's select Polygroup with Polyloop and Polygroup as the target. Then QMesh the Polygroup island, but hold Shift to turn it into a move operation. Next, go ahead and QMesh the Polygroup island. If it seems like you QMeshed it a bit too much, the Adjust Last slider can help you dial back the extrusion. Now let's unmask the bottom polygroup and move it in to give the edges a nice taper. Go ahead and select Polygroup with Polyloop and Polygroup as the target. Let's go ahead and QMesh the Polygroup island while holding Shift again. Then QMesh the Polygroup island and adjust it with the Adjust Last slider. Go ahead and repeat this process once more. Then QMesh the final polyloop in the middle. Switch to Delete Flat Island to remove the unneeded polys. To finish it up, we're going to clean up the outside of the rim by deleting those extra edge loops. Then press Ctrl W to group visible. Alright, moving on, let's control click on the canvas to mask our model. And from the gear, let's grab the polycube. Scale it up and center it in the rim. Invert the mask and split the unmasked points. Mirror and weld in the Z-axis to add an edge loop right down the middle. We're going to add a few more edge loops here, and I'm placing them in specific locations so we can scale them to help create the shape of the spoke. Unmask these edge loops and scale them along the Z-axis to match our reference. Rotate it to the side view and keep on adjusting the model to match the reference. This part might feel a bit like a chore, but the payoff will be worth it. Now let's turn on symmetry in the Z-axis. What I'm trying to do here is set up my edge flow to extrude down the middle. We want to keep it symmetrical since even slight variations will get magnified once we use a ray mesh. Using the point action of slide in the Z-modeler brush ensures we are not messing up the silhouette for the block out. We have a circle extrusion that's going to hold the bolts for the rim. It's a good idea to add in the edge loops for that part now to save us some hassle later. Now we can switch to delete flat island in the Z-modeler brush. Go ahead and alt tag those interior faces. And instead of QMesh, let's switch to polygroup just to visualize it before we go all in. Slide these points up to create an arc. Then QMesh the polygroup island. Turn on double and delete the top polygroup. Next, using delete flat island, delete the faces we don't need. Add an edge loop down the side and delete the two faces. Finally, switch to stitch for the point action, and then to endpoint for the modifier. Alright, let's keep this ball rolling. We're going to flatten these 8 faces using transpose a single poly. Press Ctrl Shift and click the poly group to isolate them, then click Auto Group. Next we want to Ctrl Shift and click the point that's between the two poly groups to select them both. Now go ahead and press Ctrl W to group visible. Now we're all set to QMesh the polygroup island. Go ahead and turn on double and get rid of any unwanted faces. Now switch to inset a single poly and alt tag those inner 16 faces. Unmask the insetted polys and run a polish by features a few times. With the gizmo, we can use the white circle as a guide for scaling the polys. Let's inset the polygroup island to create a supporting loop. Then you can either use the Z-Modeler or Gizmo to extrude. I personally went with the Gizmo because it lets me scale swiftly after extrusions. Single click on the polygroup island to repeat the inset action. Spin around to the back view and alt tag the faces we need to QMesh. Now we can remove any unwanted faces. Just a quick note, the reason QMesh retained the faces is because this is an open mesh. It's not a big deal, just something to keep in mind. Now switch to Transpose Polygroup Island and flatten your selection. Move them down near the extrusion from the other side of the mesh. What we're aiming for here is to match the angles of the extrusion for both sides. Let's inset both sides and then use QMesh Polygroup Island to punch in a hole. Let's go ahead and unmask the 4 polys and move them back using the gizmo. Then unmask and move the 4 edges back to maintain the same border thickness. Go ahead and use the Clip Circle Center brush on the top of the mesh. Moving right along, press Ctrl W to group visible. Then we'll use the Slice Curve brush to add an edge loop. Let's QMesh these faces down a bit to better match our reference. Go ahead and delete the unwanted faces. Then let's slide the edge in slightly, giving it a little bit of breathing room. Unmask the edge and scale it inwards to match the border of the hole. From the Z-Modeler brush, we'll pick Bridge 2 edges. Transpose the edge and let's give it a little bit of a rounded corner. For the other side, unmask these faces and bring in the gizmo to move them into place. Unmask the edges and move them inwards to help round it out. We'll be using the Slice Z-Modeler preset that can be found in Lightbox to redirect the edge flow. Go ahead and get rid of any unwanted edges, then press Uncrease All. We'll be making a few adjustments using the gizmo and some masking. Sometimes when you're in the middle of a blockout, you can only get so far with edge flow. That's when you need to go back and make some minor tweaks to better match the reference. If given a choice, I tend to favor the gizmo for this. It's just a bit more free-flowing and a whole lot more fun. Alright, it's time to attach the spoke to the rim. The first thing on our agenda is adding a couple of edge loops up top. We need to condense these points down to a single point so it matches with the topology of the rim. To achieve this, we'll use collapse edge to merge the points down. Let's slide these points closer to the extrusions. This will help lessen any potential creasing problems. Then we can slide these points upwards for a cleaner topology. Don't forget to collapse the edges on the back too. Now you can bring up the visibility of the rim and merge them. Let's hide the spoke and delete the faces under it. Go ahead and mask the rim and slide the spoke over until the middle edges matches up. Now let's add an edge loop on the sides of the spoke. For the ZBrush, we want insert multiple edge loops with interactive elevation. Following that, bevel the edge loop and then delete the unwanted poly on the bottom. We want to set both the polygon and edge action to do nothing, and then with the point action, set it to stitch 2 points. Setting the polygon and edge action to do nothing allows us to either use the edges or faces to execute the stitch operation. This is a win-win, as it gives us a bigger selection surface and also ensures that any misclicks won't result in another Z-modeler operation. Alright, let's take a breather and chat about something that isn't directly tied to ZBrush, but absolutely critical for us artists, and that is dealing with failure. So here I was proudly attaching the spoke to the rim when I suddenly realized I messed up big time. My spoke was facing the wrong way with the bolt holes facing in the completely wrong direction. Now I could simply re-record the modeling part and pretend nothing happened, but that feels a bit dishonest. It can lead to the assumption that perfection is the norm at a certain skill level. But here's the truth, artists stumble and fail all the time, and it's through these failures that we grow and evolve. Now, I'm with you on the fact that tutorials should be clean and easy to follow. I totally get that and I strive for it as well. However, when a mistake crops up, I see it as a chance to troubleshoot, find a solution, and most importantly, learn. This tutorial series is close to 30 hours long, and believe me, I've had my fair share of bloopers. Some of them I decided to scrap, while others I kept, because they offered a valuable learning moment or they didn't disrupt the flow. If you're not stumbling or making a few mistakes, it probably means you're staying safely within your comfort zone. And when you're too comfortable, your growth as an artist can grind to a halt. So embrace the missteps, learn from it, and keep moving forward. So if you've been following along and modeling with me, don't worry. Many of the adjustments we've made, like sliding edges around, collapsing vertices, are all steps you still need to take. If you didn't trip up like I did and stuck close to the references, you could probably just skip the next fix-it step. Now it's time to throw in a couple of edge loops to deal with those rectangle faces. Next, we want to do some gentle massaging with the vertices to get them into the right place. This might feel a bit tedious, but it's part of the modeling process. Plus, it's a good moment for your brain to shift gears and cruise in autopilot for a while. Okay, it's time to face the music and fix our error. First off, let's get rid of any unnecessary edge loops that aren't supporting the spoke's shape. Then we'll split the spoke into a separate subtool. Snap your view to the side, pull up the gizmo and choose Deformer Soft from the gear option. Now we'll use the deformer to reverse our spoke's side profile, making it protrude outwards instead of inwards. It will still need a bit of finessing, but we can get it pretty close. Press accept to lock it in and then turn on the visibility of the rim to line up the spoke. We also need to adjust the middle of the spoke so it aligns nicely with the rim's extrusion. I'm aiming for a decent gap between the points, making them easier to weld. Let's merge these two subtools and then we can weld the points. Because we already done a lot of the setup earlier, welding should be a breeze without needing any additional topology adjustments. Let's turn on dynamic to get a clear idea of what's left to weld. This is a pretty good start to fixing our issue. There are still a few minor tweaks needed, but the bulk of the work is done. Alright, let's turn on array mesh. Make sure lock position, lock size, and transpose are turned on. We'll set the repeats to 5 and rotate the X amount to 360 degrees. Press Y to switch on transpose. and set your pivot right in the center. When you're ready to make it real geometry, go ahead and hit Make Mesh. Now we're going to turn on symmetry in the x-axis and setting the radial count to 5. We're going to use the ZBrush to insert multiple edge loops. Essentially, we're just filling back the edge loops we got rid of earlier. Go ahead and press QC50 to check on our progress so far. Next up, we're going to hop on over to the rim's outer edge and add in 4 edge loops. Don't forget to uncrease them and give everything a quick look over. Let's turn off radial symmetry and start setting up some edge loops on the corner of the rim. Switch to Insert Multiple Edge Loops with Interactive Elevation. This is going to give us a little bead on the outer lip of the rim. Take a few moments to look it over, then assign it a single poly group. While it's not mandatory, I find it's a good habit to group visible when I've finished working on a piece. Alright, it's time to make the axle for the rim. Bring up the gizmo and pick Cylinder 3D from the gear icon. Set the H divides to 24. Then we can use the white cone to make it a pipe. Next, we're going to switch on symmetry in the z-axis, setting the radial count to 12. Now using the Move Infinite Depth brush, we'll tweak the inside and outside of our cylinder to get it closer to the reference. Let's spice things up a little bit by adding a couple of sliced circles in the cylinder's middle. Change it to the side view and scale everything down just a tad. Now switch to the ZBrush and QMesh the Polygroup Island. Snap it to the side and move it out a little more. Don't forget to QMesh the Polygroup Island at the front too. Time to mask the front polys and move them back with the gizmo. You can extrude the unmasked polys using the gizmo, just remember to hold down the Control key. From the ZBrush, select Slide Edge Loop Complete. Slide the edge loop up a little bit, then QMesh the flat island. Be sure to QMesh the other side too. We'll be transposing a single point with the radial symmetry set to 12. Make sure the gizmo is centered to the object, then move them downwards. Repeat the same steps for the outer points. Press QC50 and make any necessary creasing adjustments. We'll add an edge loop and crease it. Then add edge loops around the long cylinder. Click on an inside edge to repeat the last operation, and then uncrease those edge loops. We'll finish up by setting the crease level to 3. Before we wrap up this part, let's add an edge loop so we can Q-mesh the poly loop. Now let's take a look at what we got so far with the rear tire and rim. Isolate the rear axle and mask it. From the gear of the gizmo, bring in a cylinder 3D. Adjust the white cone until the cylinder's inside lines up with the outside of the axle. Invert the mask and split unmasked points. Let's press QC50 and group by normals. Next, you're going to want to Q-mesh that polygroup island. Don't forget to hold shift to activate the move operation. Just so you know, I typically leave the default angle at 45 when I press group by normals, just in case you are wondering what number I use. Alright, time to model the rear disc brake plate. Like usual, we're going to bring up the cylinder 3D from the gizmo with the H device set to 100. Let's adjust the inner radius with the white cone. Turn on symmetry in the Z-axis, setting the radial count to 5. Mask out 6 faces. Press Ctrl W to group the mask, then Q-mesh polygroup all. Now we can switch it to the side view and scale it along the Z-axis. With insert multiple edge loops, add 2 on the inner brace and 3 on the disc plate. Once you've done that, press QC50 and uncrease the corners of the brace. Press Ctrl W to group visible and dial down the crease level to 3. Mask the model and move the gizmo to the middle of the disc plate. From the gear, add another cylinder 3D and close the inner radius. Invert the mask and split unmasked points. Once more, press QC50 and scale it down. Duplicate it by holding Ctrl while moving the gizmo. Unmask the cylinders and Ctrl move to duplicate all 3 cylinders. Get them into position and rotate it properly. Clear the mask, then unmask 1 cylinder to duplicate. Now unmask the 3 cylinders and Ctrl move to duplicate all 3 cylinders once more. Let's go ahead and move them into their final positions and rotations. Be aware though, the positions and locations of these holes are not symmetrical on any axis, so go ahead and look for repeating patterns to make your life easier. When everything is in place, clear the mask and scale them a little on the Z-axis. Turn on Subtractive in the subtool list and let's move it below the base model. Now we can turn on Live Boolean and see what we got so far.